I met my property manager, and he began to harass me, to show me porn. And then he was like, come sit on my lap. And I was like, no, I'm okay. And sure enough, I got an eviction notice stating that I owed $500. So I went to his office and he was like, there's one thing you can do for me. If you do it, I'll make sure you don't get evicted. If I did not have sex with him, he was gonna put me out. As a single mom, I had no choice. I didn't want to lose my housing.
This horrific encounter between a tenant and her landlord is part of a pervasive problem that vulnerable women, and sometimes men, are subjected to. It's sexual harassment that happens in housing situations. Hello, I'm Suzzanne Douglas. You may know me from my work as an actress, but what you may not know is that I understand this story. I grew up on the south side of Chicago, and I knew women like those you'll meet today who were faced with the terrible choice between a place to live and a sexual predator. But what you will learn today is that no one has to live with that choice. You don't have to live in fear that your landlord will evict you if you don't have sex with him, or that your stove or heat won't be fixed unless you pose nude for the maintenance man in your building. The Fair Housing Act can protect you. That's what this podcast is all about. How you can use the law to help you if someone is demanding the unacceptable from you in order to keep and maintain your home. Welcome to the Safe at Home podcast, sponsored by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, better known as HUD, in partnership with the National Fair Housing Alliance. We're talking about sexual harassment in housing situations. Sexual harassment happens in housing when someone is preyed upon by an unsavory landlord, leasing agent, maintenance manager, housing authority personnel, or other housing-related workers. Our goal is to put a spotlight on the issue so that people understand what violates the law and how they can report it and stop it. What most people don't know is that the Fair Housing Act protects people from sexual harassment in housing. This law can help you put a stop to sexual harassment. We are going to tell you how. Today, we will hear the stories of 3 remarkable and courageous women. They all experienced harassment by someone associated with their housing situation, and they are willing to share their amazing stories so that other people don't have to go through the terrible things they went through. While these stories may be difficult to listen to, all have information worth noting, and all have outcomes worth sharing. Thanks for joining us. Our first participant joins us from upstate New York, Faye Lynn. Thank you for joining us and for telling your story. Tell me about yourself.
As a kid, I had friends, but I was a bit of a loner. I was into art. I liked to draw. I liked to paint. I liked to ride my bike a lot. When I was in high school, I was in ROTC, junior ROTC. I was on the rifle team. I used to shoot. I was top female in the 1st Marine Corps District for a bit. I grew up with my mom and dad, got pregnant for my daughter at 19, and moved out on my own. Once I got pregnant, I became an adult and kind of just gone with the punches. It's not been easy.
But you just told me about an amazing, strong, powerful woman who can shoot a weapon and care for a life. It's not an easy thing being a mother. I'm a mother myself. Regardless what age, you bring that life into the world. You're still using skills of love and caring for an individual. And now that you have grown into adulthood, what do you do to keep yourself occupied?
Well, I'm disabled. I have a bunch of mental health issues that keep me unable from working. I spend time with my kids. We like puzzles. With recent events, I've started becoming more of my activist self. I want to raise awareness for women's issues and crochet for Breast Cancer Awareness Month. I might not be able to work, but I can contribute in artistic ways.
Phelan, your presence in the world is contribution enough for us, and I really want to thank you for sharing who you are. And I know this is a hard thing for you maybe to speak about, but Can you tell us how the difficulty with your housing came about? I believe I read somewhere that it was Facebook that played an enormous part in getting this story out. Would you speak to that, please?
Right. So everybody's on Facebook, and every town has their own community group on Facebook. Ours is called You Know You're from Oswego When. And a friend of mine had posted that her niece had been assaulted by this landlord and that she was bringing it to the town's attention. And I knew immediately who she was speaking about because it happened to me.
Mm.
And it blew my mind how many people commented and said that they knew who she was talking about. No one said his name. And how many people knew what was going on. And it had been going on for decades. Central New York Fair Housing had reached out to my friend that made the post, and she, knowing my situation, referred them to me. And I got involved that way. But Facebook really brought everyone that this had happened to together. It was a way for all of us to be like, wow, we're not the only ones. Because you think you are. And when it's that deep of a secret in a town, when everybody knows what's happening, but nobody talks about it, nobody steps up, nobody tries to stop it, that's when it's an issue.
Mm.
When Central New York Fair Housing reached out to me, I had a second chance to make it right.
You must have felt so empowered. Tell me, how, on a more local level, did you tell anyone that you were being harassed within your community?
I went to the police station. Other than that, I didn't talk to anybody. I told people don't rent from this guy. I didn't really go into why because, again, I thought I was the only one. And it's something that women feel ashamed about when we shouldn't. And so I didn't talk to anybody until that Facebook post was made and my friend and I were able to like reconnect and be like, yo, this is what's up. We need to do something.
So you said you went to the police department. Tell me, what did the police say or do?
Nothing.
I beg your pardon?
I was in a really bad mental health position at the time. Had just gotten approved for my disability. And I went to the police literally right after it happened. Filled out a report. This happened in November. Called back next January, and I was told I never made a report.
That you never made a report.
Yep. And the ball just got dropped from there. Being in the mental state that I was, I couldn't pursue it. And I want to put out there right now to anyone that might be listening that it's okay to not be mentally okay enough to handle this type of situation.
How did you find out that HUD and fair housing would be your way into finding some help?
When Central New York Fair Housing reached out to me, I had no idea that they existed. And they were like, this is what we're doing, putting the case together, trying to get women to come forward and speak out. I knew I had to be part of it.
And that's exactly why I want you to continue to be part of this dialogue, because that's the role that you play as an advocate, as a mother. How many women do you think have been affected by this gentleman?
There have been more than 60 women that have come forward and said, hey, this happened. And of those 60 women, there were women dating back 30 years that this had been going on. And it's not okay. And it's not just Oswego, New York, that this has happened in. It's happened in all over the country. And it almost always happens to low-income women.
To that point, this kind of makes you very exposed and very vulnerable to a guy who would come on with any type of advances like that. So how does that make you feel? Tell us about the experience of dealing with this individual, if you will.
I did not rent from him. I went to look at an apartment, and he blocked my exit and assaulted me. And at that point, I decided I'm not renting from this guy. This is disgusting. If this is what's going to happen when I look for an apartment, what's going to happen when I rent from him? Mm-hmm. And he owns most of the rental properties in Oswego, New York, and it limited my decisions by so much. So finding low-income housing that would work for my budget, would work with the assistance programs that I use is not an easy task.
Mm.
And he was one of 7 or 8 at the time that would take the assistance that I was using. And when you're low income, you have no ability to just up and move. Maybe your electricity is going to get shut off, or you could buy a loaf of bread. This is where these women are at, having to make these types of decisions that, okay, well, this much of my rent is covered this month. And then the landlord comes in and he's like, we can make arrangements.
Mm.
And it turns into him trapping his tenants in a situation that they cannot get out of. People think it's so easy to just up and move, but when you make less than $1,000 a month, that's not an option.
It seems to be that it was the Fair Housing Agency that really brought you the help that you needed, that allowed you to give voice to the situation.
Yep.
I believe there was a lawsuit that was brought on at some point.
Yeah, there was a lawsuit. They contacted me via email, and we set up a time to where they could just come talk and see what they could do for me. Whenever Central New York Fair Housing would come to my house and they would ask me and make sure that my landlord is okay, that the housing is good, they always wanted to make sure that I was in a livable space since I've started getting in contact with them. They've always wanted to make sure that my needs were being met and taken care of.
I like to ask people this question: what would you have done differently in this situation if it presented itself again?
I'd pursue it right off the bat.
You speaking your truth to the situation will help thousands of men and women dealing with this important issue.
Exactly. And it's not just women that this affects. It affects men, it affects children, and everyone in their household. Some of the women that this happened to are married or had a boyfriend or a girlfriend, and that affected their lives, their relationships with their children.
So then, what happened as a result of the lawsuit? Would you speak to that?
He is no longer able to manage any of his rental properties. He had to hire a third-party agency to be able to rent. He's not allowed to step foot on properties if there are any tenants in the building.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to say he's out of the picture, but he's not one of the main landlords in Oswego anymore.
Let me ask you this. What would you recommend to the women and men listening that would help better educate them to the situation that's out there, but most importantly, where they can get help?
I can only speak for Central New York. I don't really know how it works in other states. But if you're in Central or Northern New York and you are having problems with your landlord, contact Central New York Fair Housing.
I actually had something I wanted to say to you. Courage is doing something in the face of fear. And even though you're alone, even though you struggled, you were not afraid to fight for yourself. Why are you sharing your story with us today?
Because I want people that think they're alone to know that they're not alone. For years, I thought I was the only one, and I wasn't.
There are many women and some men who believe that they are alone in this situation. My charge to you, Phelan, is to continue to be the warrior woman that you are. Because once you begin something as an advocate, you have to continue because of what you just said to me. You don't want another woman to go through this again. Thank you so much for sharing with us.
When it comes to sexual assault or rape or harassment, women have been programmed to just accept it as a part of life. And I'm not going to accept it anymore. I'm not going to accept it for my daughter. I'm not going to accept it for my sisters. And people forget that women are human because we're supposed to be playthings, and that's done. That is done. We are here We are not going to go away, and we are not alone. Every single woman I know has dealt with some sort of sexual harassment. And if it's going to end by me speaking up and saying enough is enough, then that's what it's got to take, because it's not about me. It's not about my story. It's about changing society.
Thank you for your honesty of being open and for your voice that will never again be silenced. Thank you, Phelan.
Thank you.
Our next participant joins us from St. Louis with a very compelling story to share. Welcome, Autumn. What people don't understand about those of us who have come to a place of hope and faith is the journey that got us there. I want you to share with the audience, particularly around the time when you were an adolescent at 12, what happened to begin you on this journey?
At 12 years old, I was molested. I lived with my grandmother for the most of my life, and I actually was a child of childhood rape. My mother would prostitute me out. It was a lot of things that went on in my life. So it's been a long journey.
What did you do to manage that pain?
Church and just a lot of writing. I write a lot. And just a lot of praying and asking God what my life was to entail.
And did you ever find a time where you resorted to taking drugs?
Yes, I actually had started drinking and smoking and doing drugs at the age of 12. And that's how I masked the pain of everything that was literally going on in my life. The abuse and trying to take my life several times, but it was not my time.
No, that's a realization I am grateful that you came to, that you realized somehow in your spirit that you had purpose.
Yes, right.
So what are you doing these days in St. Louis to keep yourself busy and out of trouble? Are you working?
I have 3 boys.
Oh, that's a job.
I work at Mercy South, and I actually do taxes at Liberty Tax, and I am just an elder's wife.
And so you were born in Kansas City and then moved to St. Louis?
Yes, I moved because of some things that were going on with my apartment manager.
Let's talk about what happened with your apartment manager that got you to uproot your life and move somewhere else.
It all started, I would say, July of 2012. I was in an abusive marriage, and I was doing drugs, and I lost my children. And I was at a point where I just lost myself. I lost my faith, and I gave up. And so one day I fought to leave my husband, and I left him, and I started a new journey on trying to be sober. And I fought hard to get my children back sober. I divorced. I needed to get my life straight. So I went to the housing authority, and I filed for an application to get a place. I got it April of 2013 and started living there. And the judge gave me my kids back in October of 13. And that's when I met my public housing property manager, and he began to harass me. He would always ask what I were doing. He would continually leave notes on my door. And at first, I did not think it was anything. I just kind of chalked it up to, well, he's a manager. Maybe there's something going on. So I was there 2 years, and as it got worse, when he told me one day, he was like, come sit on my lap, and I was like, no, I'm okay. And he would just literally do random things, leave notes, eviction notices, things like that on my door for me to come down to his office. He was like, let me take care of you, let me buy a house and a car. And I was like, I'm not into those things because you are a married man. Like, I just want my kids. I just want to be alone. And sure enough, it was a weekend, and I got an eviction notice on my door stating that I owed $500. And if I didn't pay it by that Monday, I was going to be put out by the sheriff's office. So I went to his office, and he was like, well, I can definitely help you. He was like, but you know what it entails? And I was like, no, sir. And he was like, well, if you just sit on my lap, I will help you. And I was like, no, I really don't want to do that. So he was like, there's one thing you can do for me. If you do it, I'll make sure you don't get evicted. In so many ways, he was like, if you don't, then I will have the sheriffs that Monday put you out. And being that I had just had my kids given back to me, I didn't want them to get taken away again. Like, the system is no place for a child. So he was just making passes. He would not let it go. And so I said, okay, what do you want? He was like, I can give you the $500, but I really want something from you. And I said, okay, what do you want? And he proceeded to tell me that if I did not have sex with him, he was going to put me out. And so as a single mom, I felt like I had no choice. Like, I didn't want to lose my kids and I didn't want to lose my housing. So he literally forced me to have sex with him in his office. I left that day, went home, didn't really tell anybody. I didn't tell my grandma, but I did tell, like, my best friend, and she was like, are you okay? When I got home, I just began to cry and ask Jesus, like, why? I just felt like the only calling on my life was to be a victim of rape, like, all my life.
My. Let me ask you, has there ever been, this is a tough question, a repeat of his actions towards you?
Yeah, this was the first time, but then after that, like, he would stalk my house. He would call me and ask me whose vehicles were in the back of my house. He would let me know that he was video recording me. He had keys to my house, and so it just kind of got worse. And then I just up and left in the middle of the night.
Now, you said you spoke to your girlfriend about the rape incident. Did you speak to her about the harassment incident so that you had a running dialogue with a confidant about his actions towards you?
Yes.
Great. Did you realize at the time that you were building a case against him?
No, I had no idea because it wasn't the first time that this has happened, like, actually in the housing. That was just the second incident with him. There was a whole nother incident with another party at the housing.
Yes, would you speak to that?
I was hospitalized, and when I got out, I got a letter on my door saying I owed like $1,000 in maintenance fees. So I went and to my property manager, of course, and he was like, no, you have to go to the main building and talk to the manager over there. So I went to the main building. I sat down and I talked to the guy, and I was asking him questions of how did this happen. I had documentation showing I was in the hospital so that it literally was not my trash. It was actually someone else's. And he proceeded to ask me if I would ever mess with a married man, and I proceeded to say no. And then he was like, well, do you like porn? And started showing me porn on his phone. And so I got really uncomfortable. And then he walked over and said, well, I'm going to go get your case file. And he went and got my file and shut his door. And as he shut his door, he still began to show me porn. And he was like, well, is your boyfriend's genitals this big or this big or this big? And I just would not respond. I just sat back in amazement because I could not believe yet again this is happening to me. And so he was like, well, I can take off $500 in fees. He was like, but you have to pay the rest and make payments. And as he sat at his computer to make those arrangements, the bigger boss walked by his office. And as the guy was walking by his office, the manager that was helping me exposed himself to me and asked me if it was smaller or bigger than my boyfriend's. And I left the office.
And your response to this, or at any point did you mention to him, I'm uncomfortable with the porn? What was that conversation?
There was none. And in my mind, I was just like, this can't be happening. I can't believe it. It was just total shock.
And you're probably thinking the whole time, you're trying to find a safe haven for you and your family. And it's a tight rope that you're walking. And did you feel like there were any resources available to you other than this girlfriend who you're just confiding in?
No. No one, because I didn't tell anybody about the incident that happened in the office. I told no one.
Not even your grandmother?
Not even my grandmother. Like, she didn't know until everything came out in 2014.
Really? Who did the first guy work for? And then who did the second guy work for?
They both work for the housing authority.
Did you ever think of going to the police?
No, because I didn't want to lose my kids. So I just kept it a secret.
So how did you come to know to reach out to HUD for some assistance with the situation with these men?
I didn't. It was God's divine intervention. And I say that every time because when the lady from HUD called me, she proceeded to tell me her name, introduce herself, and who she was, and that she asked me what had happened on the date that it happened and said that we had a report that came across her desk, and it was about the first incident in the office with the first guy exposing himself. And I started crying because no one knew that had happened. Mm-hmm. Then a lawyer showed up at my house from DOJ, and he said, Autumn, I need to know everything. We're taking it to federal court. And I broke down in my living room and told him everything that had happened.
When you said DOJ, you mean the Department of Justice, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Talk about big-time lawyers. That's wonderful. And were you just one of many named in a case?
Yes, I was first, and then I think they said a total of 23 other women stepped forward. It was in that range. I just wished I could have spoke up sooner to help other women not go through what I went through.
How old were you at that time?
I was 26, 27.
My daughter's age. My daughter's 25. And it's women like you that will give her courage to speak up. Thank you so much. How are you advocating for yourself now that this has happened to you? Are you vocal about this?
Yes, I definitely go and I tell everyone. I definitely have shared my experience on social media with my family and friends that weren't around. Mm-hmm. And I just let people know, like, if my story can help that one or two women or even men that are going through that situation to stand up and say something, then I've done my job. Since I've been sharing my story and since I actually have told my story, so many other women have came forward with both of those men doing it. And it actually exposed more men in that same office that were doing the same thing.
No one thinks that sexual harassment could take place in public housing. What advice would you give our listeners who may have experienced sexual harassment or experiencing it now?
You have to stand up and you have to tell someone, whether it's, HUD or DOJ. You have to stand up and tell your story because you don't realize just how many people your story will affect or even help just stepping forward and saying this is what happened. And it makes, I live life now better than I did before.
How was working with them? What was that experience like when she called?
It was an amazing experience to have just working with her, especially dealing with all of that I was dealing with physical and health-wise. She told me to take my time. It wasn't a rush, but she definitely helped me tell my story.
And what steps did she take to help bring your story to light?
Not only did she really investigate it, but she actually gave my case to the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C. And that's when everything started to be exposed.
Did you have to pay anything for them to help you?
No, I did not pay anything.
What was the outcome of your case that the Department of Justice won for you?
They won the case. The Housing Authority had their own in-house thing that they did. I won that. They actually had given me a settlement. I didn't ask for one. It wasn't about what they were giving me. It was the fact that I wanted them to pay for what they did. It wasn't the company itself, but I wanted the men to pay. When it went to federal court with the Department of Justice, I asked for nothing. I just told the lawyer, I just want them to be exposed. I want them to never work in a situation where they can prey upon young women or even men for that matter. And we won the case.
Wow. What a life. Do you know what happened to your harassers? To the men who harassed you, what their fate has become?
All I know when I got the paperwork is they lost everything. Everything that they had invested in and worked in so hard was gone.
They lost everything.
They lost everything.
What would you say to your younger self standing in that room, getting ready to sign those documents or look at those documents? What would you say to your younger self now that would have kept this scenario from moving forward?
Be more aware, and if you're uncomfortable, speak up and say something. Someone will hear you.
What can you say to our listeners about HUD and about the Department of Justice? What can you share with them about the information that you learned that could be of service to them should they need them?
Reach out. They are amazing people to work with. They don't judge you. They don't belittle you. They worked on my behalf diligently. And I feel like if something was to ever happen again, I can always reach out to them for information. The experience was just amazing that I went through with them.
So when you're getting this word out about sexual harassment and housing, you're also referencing the Department of Justice and HUD to let them know not just that this happened to you, but there are places, specifically the Department of Justice and HUD, that can help you.
Yes, ma'am.
What would you say to our listeners now that would benefit them from ever being as broken as you were at that time?
Stand up. It's not your fault, and don't be afraid to talk.
Autumn, it's women like you who have given purpose to this podcast. It's women like you who have the courage and the ferocity and the guts and the nerve to speak up, to give voice to those who are without a voice.
Yes, ma'am.
Because the message has to go out. Time is up.
It is. We have to take a stand.
Thank you for being brave enough to bare your soul and exposing your spirit. Thank you, Autumn, for sharing.
You're welcome.
Our third and last participant today is Sharon from North Carolina. Sharon, just chatting with you briefly before we began, you mentioned about taking care of the needs of others before yourself, even so much as going down to reclaim your grandchildren after a bad situation 3.5 years ago.
Yes, I am raising my 2 grandchildren by myself. I had to end a 27-year marriage and, just had to make some tough choices for myself, make the best choices for my 2 little grandchildren. And
those are choices that you're having to make now as an adult. But as a young adult, what kind of choices did you have to make growing up that were difficult for you?
I don't know. I'm an only child of an only child. So sometimes it was just, it felt like me against the world sometimes.
So when you were having your housing sexual harassment situation, you had no one else there to help you
No.
get through that situation?
Well, I reached out to a friend. I just mentioned how uncomfortable it was. But no, there's no mom. I have no brothers, no sisters. My dad's gone.
You weren't married at the time?
I was, but the reason I didn't reach out to him was I didn't want him to get in trouble.
You didn't want your husband to get in trouble. Explain that to me, why you wouldn't reach out to the man who you married for help because you didn't want him to get in trouble. I'm curious about that statement.
Well, that particular time, I need to paint a little picture. We were really hunting very hard for a home, and we weren't able to, to get the loans from some of the banks. So it was frustrating, but when I say that I wanted to protect him, this is a small town, and it would have been our word against this man with all this power and that had all this money. And I did reach out to tell him just not to leave me alone with him, but I didn't go in detail because I was afraid that if he reacted and it was physical in any way, that he would get arrested.
So tell us what happened.
Well, we went to church here with a realtor. We shared with her about wanting to buy a house. So she introduced us to this property owner, financer, and that, he had some properties. Well, we were excited actually because my husband was working as a maintenance man and I was working in a call center and we were doing well. So she set up the meeting and we met at a house that my husband actually is still in now. And from the very first meeting with this man, his advances were inappropriate.
What kinds of things would he do that were inappropriate, though, that he would be so bold as to exhibit in front of two other people, particularly your husband?
Well, the first time was really sly. We shook hands, and he told me that he didn't shake hands, that he wanted a hug. Mm-hmm. And his hug consisted of an embrace that just pulled me directly into his body, and he moved his chest along mine with a heavy squeeze, and as I tried to pull back, he pulled me in even harder to shake my breast on him.
So after you took this meeting, what were the next steps as to moving forward where you felt uncomfortable around this predator?
Well, the second meeting, we went back to the house, and my husband was in one room, I was in another, and I was looking inside of the closet, and he comes behind me. I didn't even hear him, actually, and he grabbed both my breasts. And I pushed him off me and told him not to ever touch me again. And he just gave this little sideways smile and walked away. And I still didn't say anything.
And then the next meeting that you took with him?
When we were going up the steps at the attorney's office, he grabbed my behind going up the steps. It didn't matter if my husband turned his head, he was trying to touch me. I just thought once the papers were signed, it'd be over.
How did that make you feel that you had allowed this to happen and you were thinking about your home and the need for that home, and what was going through your head at that time?
Well, honestly, Suzzanne, to tell you the truth, as a child, it happened. Mm-hmm. So I guess there may have been a part of me that had to keep that secret as a child. Mm-hmm. And there were so many times that there were unwanted advances.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That became your normal because as a child you had been violated. And do you think that silenced you in any way?
Yes. It was a family member, and I was small. I didn't know how to process that, and it took years, and I'm still talking with a counselor to deal with it. So
you take those wounds from your childhood, you're now an adult, you're here now a third time with this sexual predator.
Yeah.
And then the next time he makes any advances on you. Tell us about that.
He would come by and talk with my husband and tell him that he could own other properties and those kind of things. And there had been times when we were looking at other properties and he would show up there. And if my husband left the room, he would try to reach out for me. And anytime he was around me, he made an advance. But I did share with any woman, if they ask how we got our house, I would let them know, if you have any daughters, don't be alone with him. Don't let him get near you. In some ways, I felt like I was controlling the situation because it didn't get past the groping. And in my mind, I think I saw it as a victory because he didn't take this other part of me.
Absolutely.
That had been taken before, even though there was unwanted groping.
By chance, did you mention his behavior to you said it was a church sister who had given you him as a reference. Did you mention to her what was happening with this guy?
I did. I mentioned to the realtor, and the women in the area knew this man. All of the realtors knew that his MO is, if you're a woman, he's going to try to grab you. They knew that.
So there wasn't even a question about you thinking you were the only one, because you weren't.
No.
Because it was quite evident that everyone knew of this man's behavior.
Yeah. If you were a woman and he got a chance to put his hands on you, he tried. He sold homes and rented homes, and he would exploit women who were not able to pay their bills and give them other alternatives.
And here we are now, and justice has been served because the Department of Justice found out about your case. How did the Department of Justice find out about your case and what had been happening?
It was a blessing and an accident at the same time, because my husband had reached out for a wrongful termination suit. He had spoken with an attorney. And again, we were apart then, but they called me to ask some questions about things that had happened to him, and the conversation with the administrative assistant or paralegal. But anyway, it was something that she said to me that prompted me to ask the question about what had happened to me. And I just posed the question to them, well, this happened to me. Is there anything that can be done about it? And when the attorney spoke with me about that, he said that the statute of limitations had expired, but he knew someone in the Department of Justice and he would pass that on.
So how much time had passed?
Let's see, it was 2012. It was over 3 years on the sexual harassment. But when they reached out to the Department of Justice, and when they got involved, they subpoenaed his records of all of his renters and the people who purchased homes. And then as they talked to other women, they found out that this pattern was something that was his normal.
Do you know how many other women were affected by him?
I know that they were able to find at least, I think, 18. But I'm sure that there was more that never said anything. And some of the realtors that never spoke up.
How was justice served, though? He had to and was held accountable
Yes.
by the Department of Justice. Tell us about that.
Well, I have nothing but praise for those guys.
For the Department of Justice?
Yes. They listened and they made it their mission, to make this thing right. All of the things that I had said, some of the same things were told to them by other women, so they knew it was all true. But he had to make amends. He had to pay fines and can never be in real estate again. And that's wonderful. It makes me feel good.
And he was the only game in town, pretty much. And so that was a big blow to his industry, wouldn't you say?
Yeah. I think he had to sell his business to other businesses. And
how does it make you feel to take down someone like that and to see justice served? How do you feel as a woman, as a mother, as an advocate?
Yeah. I can't really put into words to know that my voice was heard, that our voice was heard over this, because so many times women go through these things and you're not believed, or you feel as though you're ashamed. It happened to you, but you're ashamed, and you don't want anybody to know that these things are happening. But to know that everybody in this town knew what kind of man he was, I can't tell you how thankful I am that he'll never do that to anyone else again.
So our takeaway for our audience is tell somebody, advocate for yourself, and keep that story going, because there are little girls who are going to need your voices and the voices of other women to speak up loudly and clearly and constantly. And they need to know it's not your fault. Sharon, thank you for sharing your big old heart.
Thank you for letting me tell this story.
We have just heard about the experiences of 3 different women who faced sexual harassment and abuse. While their stories are quite different, there are, of course, shared takeaways. There are two types of sexual harassment in housing situations that were covered. The first is when a housing provider makes someone engage in sex or sex-related conduct as a condition of obtaining or maintaining housing. The technical name for this is quid pro quo harassment, but what that means is that the housing provider is asking you for sex or to pose naked or send him naked pictures of you or something like that in exchange for things like getting an apartment or cheaper rent or fixing your heat or unclogging your sink. You do not have to do these things to live safely in your apartment. The second type of harassment involves what we call a hostile environment. This happens when someone like your landlord or the janitor or the guy who works at your housing authority makes sexual comments to you, touches you without permission, sends you inappropriate text messages, exposes himself to you, comes into your apartment uninvited, and other things that make you feel uncomfortable in or around your home. This type of behavior usually has to happen more than once to constitute a hostile environment. No one should have to feel unsafe in their home. You can say no and tell someone to stop engaging in this behavior. If it's someone who works for your landlord or management company, report that harasser's behavior and ask that it stop. If it doesn't stop, you can do something about it. All the women we heard from today were finally able to get help. I think they would all say they wish they had known much earlier about where to get help. So let me tell you where you, or someone you know, can get help now. There are 3 main resources that can help you stop sexual harassment. First, you can find help in many local communities through a fair housing agency. Fair housing agencies investigate violations of the Fair Housing Act, provide you with support, and help you with taking the steps to put an end to the harassment. You can find the Fair Housing Center nearest you at www.nationalfairhousing.org, or you can search online by typing in the name of the nearest city and the words Fair Housing. You can file a complaint of sexual harassment with HUD via its website, hud.gov/fairhousing/sexual harassment, or by calling HUD at 1-800-669-9777. HUD will investigate your complaint of sexual harassment and assist you in putting a stop to it. You may also contact the U.S. Department of Justice by sending an email to fairhousing@usdoj.gov or by calling them at 1-844-380-6178. If you believe that you have or are experiencing any form of sexual harassment by a landlord, maintenance worker, or anyone associated with your housing, please do not hesitate to reach out for help. Do not keep it to yourself. You can do something to help yourself that will help others as well. You are protected by the Fair Housing Act. The law is on your side, period. And if you ever fear for your safety, call 911. This is your host, Suzzanne Douglas, thanking you for joining us.
If you missed any part of this podcast or wish to listen again, go to hud.gov/fairhousing/sexual harassment. That's hud.gov/fairhousing/sexual harassment. This podcast was produced by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development in partnership with the National Fair Housing Alliance.